Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in again. Tonight we're jumping into some unsettling true horror stories that'll make you think twice about everyday encounters. So get comfortable, or maybe not too comfortable, and let's get started.
I was moving to a new city and needed furniture on the cheap, so I turned to Craigslist. I found this amazing deal, a full bedroom set barely used for half the price of what it would be new. The guy selling it seemed legit enough through text, and the pictures of the furniture were exactly what I needed. The only catch was that he didn't have a truck to deliver it, so I had to come to his place to pick it up. No big deal, right?
He lived in a quiet neighborhood, a bit out of the way, but nothing too sketchy. I drove over one evening after work, feeling optimistic. When I pulled up to his house, things seemed normal enough. It was a bit rundown, but there were lights on, and his car was in the driveway. I texted him that I had arrived, and he replied, "Come on in, door's open." That's when the first red flag hit me. Who leaves their door unlocked for a stranger coming over for a Craigslist transaction? But I brushed it off, thinking maybe he just trusted his neighborhood. I opened the door and called out, "Hello?" But the place was dead silent. The house was dimly lit, and the furniture he had posted online was nowhere in sight. The living room was practically empty except for a few old, beat-up chairs. I called out again, "Hey, I'm here for the furniture." Still, no response. I took a few steps inside, my nerves starting to kick in. That's when I heard the floor creak behind me. I turned around, and there he was, standing in the hallway, blocking the door. His face was completely different from the friendly guy I'd been texting. His eyes were dark, and he had this unsettling grin. "Furniture's in the back," he said, motioning toward a room down the hall. I don't know what came over me, but every instinct in my body was screaming to get out of there. I didn't care about the furniture anymore. I mumbled some excuse about forgetting something in my car and quickly walked past him. The moment I stepped outside, I sprinted to my car, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I got a text from him. "You're missing out on a great deal." I never responded and blocked the number immediately. To this day, I have no idea what was waiting for me in that back room, and I don't want to know.
Last year, I was in desperate need of a job. I had just been laid off, and rent was due. So when I saw a Craigslist ad for a personal assistant paying way above what I expected, I jumped on it. The guy who posted the ad claimed he was a busy entrepreneur, needed help organizing his office and managing emails. It seemed legit, nothing out of the ordinary. He emailed me back almost immediately, asking me to meet him at his home office for an interview. It felt a little weird, but I was desperate, so I agreed. When I arrived at the address he gave me, it wasn't an office. It was a house on the outskirts of town. Not the nicest place, but not the worst either. I knocked on the door, and a middle-aged man answered. He was average looking, wearing a business casual outfit, and didn't seem out of place. He invited me in, explaining that he worked from home, so things were informal. Inside, the house was a mess. Papers everywhere, boxes stacked in corners, and a weird smell that I couldn't place. He led me to a back room, claiming it was his office. The room had a desk, but there was no computer, no filing cabinets, just more boxes and papers scattered on the floor. That's when the alarm bells started going off in my head. He sat down and started asking me really personal questions, stuff that had nothing to do with the job, like if I lived alone, what my daily schedule was, whether anyone knew I was there. I was uncomfortable, to say the least, but I didn't want to be rude. So, I tried to steer the conversation back to the job, but he kept deflecting. At one point, he leaned forward and said, "You know, this job requires more than just answering emails. You'll need to be really flexible." The way he said it sent chills down my spine. I made up an excuse about having another interview and left as quickly as I could. As I was walking to my car, I felt his eyes on me the entire time. I never heard from him again, but for weeks, I had this awful feeling that he was still watching me, waiting for me to come back. I'd been wanting a dog for a while, but I couldn't afford to buy one from a breeder or even a shelter. So, when I saw a post on Craigslist for a free puppy, I was all over it. The guy claimed he couldn't take care of the dog anymore because he was moving across the country. He sounded legit, and the picture of the dog was adorable. exactly what I was looking for. He asked me to meet him in a park to pick up the dog. It wasn't a remote park or anything, so I didn't think twice about it. When I arrived, there weren't many people around, but it didn't seem too weird. I saw him sitting on a bench with a small crate beside him. When I approached, he smiled and stood up, saying, "You must be here for the puppy." I nodded and he handed me the crate. I peeked inside, and there was no dog, just an old blanket. "Where's the puppy?" I asked, confused. His smile faded and his expression turned cold. "You'll get it soon enough," he muttered before quickly walking away. I stood there, stunned, clutching the empty crate. Then I realized this wasn't about a dog at all. I dropped the crate and sprinted back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back until I was halfway home, too scared to process what had just happened. To this day, I don't know what his real intentions were, but I never browsed Craigslist again after that. I'm an amateur model, and sometimes I take on small gigs from Craigslist to build my portfolio. Most of them are fine, low pay but decent work. However, one listing nearly cost me my life. A photographer posted an ad looking for models for a private project. He promised good pay and said it was for an exclusive collection. His email was professional, and his website had examples of his work. It all looked legitimate. We arranged a time to meet at a studio on the edge of town. When I arrived, the place was empty. It was a rundown building, not at all like the professional studio I expected. But I was already there, so I figured I'd at least check it out. The photographer greeted me at the door, smiling. He was older, maybe in his 50s, and had this unsettling energy. Inside, the place was a wreck, dusty, with broken furniture and no proper lighting setup. I started to feel uneasy, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just a quirky artist. He asked me to follow him to the back room where the shoot would take place. As soon as I stepped inside, I saw a chair in the middle of the room with ropes tied to the arms and legs. My blood ran cold. "You're gonna love this project," he said, locking the door behind me. I didn't wait to find out what he had planned. I shoved past him, ran to the front door, and didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away. After that, I reported the ad, but it disappeared from Craigslist almost immediately. I still wonder how many others fell into that trap before me. So I was moving into a new apartment and needed some furniture, but money was tight. Naturally, I hit Craigslist. I found this ad for a free couch, decent condition, not far from where I lived. The guy had a brief description and said he was moving out, just needed someone to pick it up. Sounded perfect. I messaged him, and we arranged for me to come by that evening. His apartment was in a sketchy part of town, but I figured it was just the usual cheap rent, bad neighborhood situation. When I got there, he buzzed me in, and I went up to the second floor. The door was cracked open when I arrived, which gave me an uneasy feeling, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. People leave their doors open when they're expecting someone, right? I knocked lightly and called out, "Hello?" A man appeared, middle-aged, balding, wearing a stained t-shirt. He smiled, but something about his eyes put me on edge. He gestured for me to come inside. The couch was right there in the living room, but the cushions were missing. "It's in the back room," he said, his voice low, almost a mumble. I stood there for a moment, not sure what to do. The place smelled off, like mildew and something else I couldn't place. "No worries, I'll just take it as is," I said, edging toward the couch, hoping I could just get out of there fast. "Nah, you want the cushions. They're good cushions," he insisted, walking toward a closed door at the end of the hallway. I don't know what possessed me to follow him, but I did. I told myself it was just cushions. But as I stepped into the narrow hallway, something felt wrong. The further I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was in the apartment. I couldn't hear any traffic, no distant hum of the city, just silence. He opened the door to a small, dark room. "They're in there," he said, but didn't step inside. I peered into the room, but before I could react, I felt his hand on my back, shoving me in. I stumbled forward, hitting the wall, and spun around just in time to see him slam the door shut. I was locked in. I banged on the door, screaming for him to let me out, but he didn't answer. Panic set in as I realized my phone was in my bag, outside in the living room. The room was almost pitch black, with only a faint light coming from a small barred window. I could hear him pacing outside the door. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, trying to figure out what to do. Suddenly, I heard voices from the hallway. Someone else had come into the apartment. "You get her?" a gruff voice asked. "She's in there," the guy replied. I froze. What the hell was going on? Before they could do anything else, I started kicking the door as hard as I could, screaming at the top of my lungs. I don't know if it was the noise or if they thought I'd somehow get out, but I heard them curse and run out of the apartment. After a few minutes of silence, I managed to break the door open and bolted for the exit. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building and halfway down the street. I never reported it. I should have, but I was too scared and embarrassed. I learned my lesson, though. No more Craigslist freebies for me. I've been saving up for a used car for months and finally found a great deal on Craigslist. A guy was selling a 2012 Honda Civic for a steal, way under market price. The post said he was moving out of state and needed to sell it fast. It had a clean title, low miles, and looked pristine in the photos. Too good to be true? Yeah, probably, but I figured I'd at least check it out. We set up a time to meet at a local gas station during the afternoon, which seemed safe enough. When I arrived, I spotted the car right away, and it looked just like the photos. Clean, shiny, no obvious damage. The guy, a little scruffy looking but polite enough, was waiting by the car. He handed me the keys to take it for a test drive, and everything felt fine. The engine sounded smooth, the brakes were responsive, and it had decent acceleration. After a quick loop around the block, I parked it back at the gas station and told him I was interested. That's when things got weird. "So, do you want to do the paperwork here, or would you rather come by my place to finalize everything?" he asked, glancing around nervously. I wasn't keen on following a stranger to his house, but he mentioned having the title and registration paperwork at home. Against my better judgment, I agreed to follow him a short distance to his place, thinking it was just a simple transaction. His place turned out to be an old, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The yard was overgrown and the windows were boarded up. I immediately regretted my decision, but I was in too deep now. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed two other men standing on the porch watching me. The guy got out of his car and waved me over. "Come on in. We'll take care of the paperwork inside." I hesitated, my heart racing. "Actually, I'd prefer to do it out here." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nah, it's easier inside, trust me." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to piss him off. I took a deep breath and slowly walked toward the house. As I stepped onto the porch, one of the men blocked the doorway. "What's the rush?" he asked, his voice cold. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way out of this. Just then, I saw another car pull into the driveway. It was a neighbor, a middle-aged woman who clearly lived nearby. She got out of her car and stared at the scene, her eyes darting between me and the men. "Everything all right?" she called out. It was enough of a distraction for me to back away. "Yeah, actually, I'm good. I'm gonna pass on the car." I quickly turned around and walked back to my car, feeling the eyes of the men burning into me. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of them in my rearview mirror, huddling together and talking in low voices. I never went back to Craigslist for a car deal again. I was in a bind. I had to move out of my apartment ASAP, but didn't want to break the lease, so I decided to sublet my place. I posted an ad on Craigslist, and within a day, got a response from a guy named Tim. He seemed legit, said he was moving to the city for work and needed a place right away. We exchanged a few emails and he offered to pay 2 months' rent up front. Perfect. The first red flag came when he asked if he could move in late at night. He claimed his work hours were crazy and he wouldn't get into town until after midnight. I wasn't thrilled, but I needed the money, so I agreed. He showed up around 1 a.m., looking disheveled and carrying just one duffel bag. Something about him was off, but I brushed it aside, figuring he was just tired from the drive. I gave him a quick tour and handed over the keys, then headed to my new place across town. A couple of days later, I decided to swing by the apartment to grab some mail. I texted Tim to let him know I'd be stopping by, but he didn't respond. When I got there, I noticed the windows were all covered up with black trash bags. My heart started racing, but I convinced myself he was just being weirdly private. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I used my spare key to let myself in. and the smell hit me immediately. It was a mix of something rotten and chemical, like cleaning supplies and decay. The place was trashed. My furniture was overturned, and there were strange stains on the floor. I called out for Tim, but the apartment was dead silent. I quickly checked the bedroom, and that's when I found the duffel bag. It was sitting open on the bed, and inside were zip ties, duct tape, and a hunting knife. My stomach dropped. I bolted out of the apartment and called the police. When they arrived, they found no sign of Tim, but they told me the apartment had clearly been prepped for something bad. They said I was lucky I hadn't come by any sooner. I never heard from Tim again, but I'm still haunted by the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't gone to check the place when I did. I was in between jobs, desperate for money, so I started browsing Craigslist for quick gigs. Most of the jobs were the usual, moving furniture, painting houses, until I found this one that seemed pretty straightforward. A guy was looking for someone to help him organize his basement for $200. He said he had some old furniture and boxes that needed to be sorted through and moved to a storage unit. I figured it'd be easy money, so I replied, and we set up a time for me to come over the next morning. When I arrived, the guy was waiting for me outside his house. He was older, maybe in his 50s, and seemed friendly enough. He led me around to the side of the house and down a set of stairs to the basement. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a chill. The basement was dark and damp, with just a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Old furniture and cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls. The guy told me to start by moving some of the larger furniture to one side of the room while he sorted through the boxes. I got to work, trying not to think too much about how creepy the place felt. After about an hour, I noticed the guy hadn't said a word in a while. When I glanced over at him, he was just standing there, staring at me with this weird grin on his face. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer, just kept smiling. At this point, my gut was screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I went back to moving furniture, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I made up some excuse about needing to take a break and bolted up the stairs. When I got outside, I realized I'd left my phone in the basement. I debated going back in for it, but something in my gut told me not to. I ran to my car and drove straight home, leaving my phone behind. Later that day, I borrowed a friend's phone to call mine, hoping the guy would pick up and I could arrange to get it back. But when I called, the phone went straight to voicemail. I never heard from him again, and I never went back for the $200 or my phone. Something about that job wasn't right, and I'm glad I trusted my instincts. Sometimes the easy money isn't worth the risk. I was desperate for cash, as I'm sure many people are when they turn to Craigslist. I'd just lost my job, rent was due, and I had zero savings. I stumbled upon an ad looking for a female model for an art project. The pay was good, $500 for a few hours of work. The ad claimed it was a legitimate gig, no nudity involved, just some creative photography work for an upcoming gallery exhibit. Seemed easy enough. I sent an email, and within the hour, I got a reply. The guy introduced himself as Tom, said he was a local photographer, and that his studio was just a few miles out of town. We arranged to meet at his place the following afternoon. At this point, everything seemed normal. He was polite, explained the concept for the shoot in detail, and assured me I'd be in and out in a few hours. The address he gave me led to a small, rundown house at the edge of town. It was far from the professional studio I'd imagined, but he mentioned he was working from home temporarily. I figured that was fine. Artists aren't always known for having the best spaces, right? I knocked on the door, and Tom, an average-looking guy in his late 30s, answered. His smile seemed genuine, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. He led me inside, and the house smelled damp, like it hadn't been aired out in months. I brushed it off and followed him into a small room where he had a cheap-looking camera set up and some blankets draped across the walls. Studio, I thought sarcastically. He asked me to change into an old-fashioned white dress he'd laid out, which felt weird. It wasn't mentioned in the email, but I chalked it up to creative direction and reluctantly agreed. As I changed in the bathroom, I heard him talking to someone. I peeked through the crack in the door, but I couldn't see anyone else. My stomach turned, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. When I came out, Tom asked me to stand in the corner of the room, facing away from the camera. The way he directed me felt off, like he was getting way too close. I couldn't shake the creepy vibe, so I asked if we could start with some normal poses instead. Tom hesitated for a moment, his smile fading. "No, let's just go with this," he insisted. Something in his tone made me nervous. I told him I wasn't comfortable and maybe this wasn't the right fit for me after all. That's when everything shifted. His friendly demeanor vanished. He grabbed my wrist hard, yanking me toward the camera. "You're not leaving yet," he muttered, his grip tightening. Panic surged through me as I realized I was alone in this isolated house with no idea what his intentions really were. I managed to pull away from him, backing toward the door, but he blocked my path. My heart raced as I scanned the room for anything I could use to defend myself. I spotted a heavy lamp on a side table and lunged for it. Before Tom could react, I swung it at him, hitting him hard on the shoulder. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to dart toward the door. I ran out of the house as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When I finally sped off, I didn't look back. I was too scared to even call the police at first, afraid they wouldn't believe me. But after a few days, I realized I had to report it. When I did, the officer told me that other women had filed similar complaints about a man matching Tom's description, but they'd never had enough to charge him. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts and gotten out of there. I never heard from him again, and I've never answered a Craigslist ad since. A few months ago, I moved into a new apartment and needed to furnish it on a budget. I found a Craigslist ad offering a free couch in great condition. The guy said he was moving out of state and couldn't take it with him. Perfect, right? The pictures looked decent, and I thought, why not? It's free. I reached out and arranged to pick it up later that afternoon. When I got to the address, it was in a sketchy part of town. The house was run down, but I figured people in transition don't always live in the best places. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a tall, scruffy man in his late 40s opened it. He seemed friendly enough, though something about his eyes unsettled me. He led me through the house to the back where the couch was. As I walked in, I noticed the place was a mess. Dirty dishes everywhere, the smell of something rotting hanging in the air. Still, I was focused on getting the couch and getting out. The couch looked a bit more worn than in the pictures, but I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I told him I'd take it. Just as I bent down to help him lift it, I heard a door slam upstairs. I froze. "Is someone else here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Nah," he said quickly, "just the wind." But the way he said it made my skin crawl. As we started to move the couch, he got weirdly close, almost pressing against me. Every time I tried to take a step back, he'd step in closer. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he just didn't have much spatial awareness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When we got the couch to my truck, I thanked him, ready to leave. But then he asked me to come back inside to grab one last thing. My instincts screamed no, but I didn't want to seem rude. Against my better judgment, I followed him back into the house. The second I stepped through the door, I heard a soft creak from upstairs. "Are you sure no one's here?" I asked again. But before he could answer, a woman's voice called out from the hallway. "Who's down there, John?" I froze. He hadn't mentioned anyone else being here, and I definitely wasn't prepared for this new twist. The woman's voice was raspy, and she sounded agitated. John's face paled, and he quickly muttered something under his breath. "I think I'm good, actually," I said, backing toward the door. As I turned to leave, I heard the woman yell, "She's not going anywhere!" The sound of hurried footsteps followed. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting to my truck. I didn't stop to look back, and I peeled out of the driveway faster than I ever thought possible. That couch wasn't worth it. To this day, I have no idea who that woman was or what she wanted, but something about the way she said, "She's not going anywhere," still haunts me. My fiance and I had just bought our first house. We were on a tight budget and needed some minor renovations done. Nothing major, just a few fixes to get the place ready. I found a Craigslist ad from a handyman who offered cheap rates and seemed experienced. His name was Mike, and he seemed friendly over the phone, so I hired him to help with some repairs. He showed up the next morning, a bit rough around the edges but polite enough. I gave him a list of tasks, and he got to work. At first, everything seemed fine. He was fixing things quickly, and I was relieved to have found someone within our budget. But as the day went on, he started lingering in the rooms where I was. Every time I'd walk into the kitchen, he'd conveniently be there, asking me questions about the house or trying to make small talk. It was harmless at first, but then he started making comments about my appearance, compliments that felt a little too personal. By the time my fiancé came home, Mike was acting overly friendly, even asking if we wanted to grab a drink after he was done. My fiancé brushed it off, but I felt uneasy. I paid Mike for the day and told him we'd let him know if we needed more work done, hoping that would be the end of it. The next day, I got a text from Mike. "Hey, just wanted to see if you needed any more help today." I didn't respond. Something about his vibe the day before had made me uncomfortable, and I didn't want to invite him back. That night, around 11 p.m., I heard a knock on our door. My fiancé was asleep, so I went to check. Through the peephole, I saw Mike standing there, smiling. My heart sank. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away quietly and went to wake my fiancé. When we came back to the door, Mike was gone, but we found a note tucked under the doormat. It just said, "I'll be back." I had just moved to a new city for a job and was looking for a roommate to split the rent. I found an ad on Craigslist from a guy named Brian, who said he was looking for a place to stay for a few months while he got back on his feet. He seemed normal enough in the emails, and after meeting him at a coffee shop, I figured it'd be fine. For the first month or so, things were pretty normal. Brian kept to himself and paid rent on time. But slowly, things started to get weird. He started hanging around the apartment more, even when I wasn't there. One time I came home early from work, and he was sitting in my bedroom, just staring at my computer. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was just admiring the setup. Then, I started noticing little things missing. Small amounts of money, food from the fridge, even clothes. When I confronted Brian, he denied everything, acting offended that I'd accuse him. A week later, I came home to find all my things rearranged. My drawers had been opened, my bed was made differently, and all the food in the fridge had been replaced with stuff I didn't buy. It was as if he was trying to make the place his own. That's when I told him he needed to move out. He didn't take it well. His calm exterior cracked, and he started yelling, saying I had no right to kick him out and that he was entitled to stay. The next few days were tense, but he finally left. Or so I thought. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door. There, in the darkness, was Brian, standing in the middle of the hallway, holding a knife. I'm a musician, always looking for side gigs to make ends meet, so Craigslist has been a godsend over the years. I've found gigs through the platform that pay decently, but one experience still haunts me. A couple of months ago, I found an ad for a wedding band that needed a last-minute guitarist. The pay was good, almost too good, and the guy said they were in a tight spot because their guitarist had bailed last minute. After a quick phone call with the guy, who introduced himself as Mark, I agreed to meet them for a rehearsal before the wedding. He told me to come to his house, where the band would practice. When I arrived, it was a bit strange. The house was way out in the middle of nowhere. I had to drive down this long dirt road that barely seemed like it was still part of the city. I thought, okay, maybe it's just a private venue. When I pulled up, though, it wasn't a house. It was more like an old, rundown shack. There weren't any other cars in the driveway, and the place looked deserted. I parked and texted Mark to let him know I was there. A few minutes later, the door creaked open, and out came Mark, looking pretty disheveled. He waved me in, saying the rest of the band was running late, but we could jam a bit while we waited. Alarm bells started going off in my head, but I shrugged it off, thinking I'd driven all the way out here, might as well make the most of it. Inside, the house was worse than it looked outside. Trash everywhere, dishes piled up, and it smelled off. No signs of instruments or any kind of setup for a band. I asked where the rest of the equipment was, and Mark laughed, saying they kept everything packed up to be ready to go. At this point, I was feeling more than a little uneasy. so I made up an excuse about needing to grab something from my car and headed for the door. As I reached the front door, Mark's tone changed. He said something like, "Don't rush off, man. We're just getting started." He stepped in front of the door, blocking my way. Panic shot through me. I mumbled something about needing to check a call and pushed past him. His hand shot out and grabbed my arm hard. "Stay a bit longer," he said, his voice low and menacing. I yanked my arm free and bolted out the door to my car. I didn't even look back to see if he was following. When I got to my car, I locked the doors and sped down that dirt road like my life depended on it. I later tried to report the ad to Craigslist, but by the time I went back to look, it had been deleted. I don't know what his deal was, but I've never responded to a Craigslist gig since then. About a year ago, I was looking to furnish my new apartment on a tight budget, so I started checking Craigslist for free stuff. I came across a post offering a free bedroom set, dresser, bed frame, and nightstands. The pictures looked great, and the guy who posted it said he was moving and didn't want to haul everything with him. The address he gave me was in a quiet neighborhood about 30 minutes from where I lived. When I got there, the house seemed normal, maybe a little older, but nothing to raise any red flags. A guy in his mid-40s opened the door when I knocked. He seemed friendly, but there was something off about him, like his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I followed him inside, where he led me to the back room to show me the furniture. The room looked like it had been cleared out, except for the furniture I was supposedly there to pick up. While he was explaining how to disassemble the bed frame, I noticed the door to the room was shut. I didn't remember him closing it when we came in. That's when things got weird. He stood there, too close for comfort, and started asking personal questions. "Do you live alone? Do you have family nearby?" I tried to brush off his questions, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. I made up an excuse about needing to grab my tools from the car to take the bed apart, hoping to get out of there and not come back. But as I moved toward the door, he stepped in front of it. My heart started racing. I forced a laugh and said I'd be right back, but he didn't move. Instead, he just stared at me, his face suddenly serious. I'm not sure how, but I managed to stay calm and act like I wasn't scared. I slowly backed up, pretending to inspect the bed again, and then made a sudden dash for the door. I pushed him aside and yanked the door open, running out of the house as fast as I could. When I got to my car, I locked the doors and sped away. My phone started buzzing with texts from the guy, asking why I left so suddenly, but I never responded. I reported the incident to Craigslist and blocked his number. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if I hadn't trusted my gut and gotten out of there. After my last roommate bailed on me, I was in a bind. Rent was coming up, and I couldn't cover it all on my own, so I put up an ad on Craigslist for a new roommate. I got a response pretty quickly from a guy named Jake, who said he'd just moved to the city for a job and needed a place to stay. He seemed normal enough over email, so we arranged to meet in person. When Jake showed up, he looked clean-cut and friendly. We had a quick chat, and everything seemed fine, so I agreed to let him move in. At first, things were okay. He was quiet, kept to himself, and paid his share of the rent. But then, little things started happening. I'd come home from work and find my stuff had been moved around, or things would go missing. Small stuff like my phone charger, snacks, random things from my room. I asked him about it, but he always denied knowing anything. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, but then it got worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Jake getting up to use the bathroom, but when I opened my eyes, I saw him standing in my bedroom doorway, just staring at me. I froze. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. He didn't answer, just stood there for a few more seconds before turning around and walking back to his room. After that, I couldn't sleep. I started locking my door at night, but I still felt uneasy. I told Jake he needed to move out by the end of the month, and that's when he lost it. He started yelling, saying I had no right to kick him out, that he wasn't going anywhere. The night before he was supposed to leave, I came home from work to find all my things scattered across the apartment. My clothes were thrown everywhere, dishes smashed, and Jake was gone. I called the police, but they didn't find him. I had to change the locks and stay with a friend for a while. I've never used Craigslist for roommates again. A couple of months ago, I was looking for a used car. I found a listing on Craigslist that seemed like a great deal, an older model sedan for cheap, and the pictures looked decent. The seller, a guy named Rob, said he was selling it because he was moving out of state and didn't need the car anymore. We arranged to meet in a parking lot near a strip mall. When I got there, Rob was waiting by the car, leaning against the hood. He looked a little rougher than I expected, but I didn't think much of it. We exchanged pleasantries, and he handed me the keys to take it for a test drive. I got in and noticed the inside smelled a little musty, but I figured it was just from sitting around for a while. As I was driving, though, I noticed something odd. There was no registration paperwork or insurance card in the glove box. I asked Rob about it when I got back, and he gave me a vague answer about the paperwork being at his house. That's when I started getting a bad feeling. I told him I'd need to see the paperwork before I made any decisions, but he started getting pushy, saying the car wouldn't last long at that price and that I should just trust him. I refused, and as I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm and yanked me back toward the car. "We're not done here," he said, his grip tightening. I yanked free and ran to my own car, locking the doors behind me. As I sped out of the parking lot, I saw Rob in my rearview mirror, glaring at me. Later, I found out that the car had been reported stolen. If I hadn't trusted my gut, I don't know what could have happened. I had been searching for a new apartment for weeks and was starting to lose hope. The rent prices in my city were insane, so when I found a beautiful 2-bedroom place on Craigslist for well under the usual price, I thought I hit the jackpot. The pictures showed a clean, modern apartment with hardwood floors, a spacious kitchen, and a balcony with a great view. The listing said the owner was an older man who just wanted someone responsible to take care of his property while he was out of the country for a few months. I reached out right away. The guy, Sam, responded almost immediately and said he could show me the place the next day. He mentioned he would only be in town for a couple of days before leaving, so it was first come, first served. Something about it seemed too good to be true, but my desperation made me ignore those doubts. The next day I arrived at the building, which was a bit older than in the photos, but still decent. Sam greeted me outside. He was in his late 50s, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. He looked a bit rough around the edges, but he was polite enough. We made small talk as we entered the building and went up to the second floor. Once inside, the apartment looked just like the photos, and I was already picturing myself living there. Sam gave me a quick tour, but there was one room he didn't open. I asked about it, and he hesitated, saying it was just a storage room for his things. That seemed weird, but again I pushed the thought aside. As we wrapped up, he asked if I was ready to sign the lease. I said I'd need a day to think about it, but he got pushy. "I've got a lot of interest," he said. "If you don't decide today, it might be gone." The pressure made me feel uneasy, so I told him I'd give him an answer by the end of the day. As I was about to leave, I realized I forgot my phone on the kitchen counter. I turned back to grab it and noticed Sam had moved closer to the front door, standing in front of it like he was blocking my exit. My gut told me something was off. I laughed it off and said, "I'll be in touch," as I sidestepped him and reached for the doorknob. But then, the door wouldn't budge. He had locked it without me noticing. My heart started racing. I tried to stay calm, and I asked, "Mind unlocking this?" Sam stared at me for a moment, his smile gone. "You're really going to walk away from this deal?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys like I was just adjusting them, hoping he didn't notice the shaking in my hands. "Yeah, I'll think about it." After what felt like an eternity, he unlocked the door. I bolted out of there as fast as I could without running. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a while, my heart pounding. I checked the Craigslist ad again, and it had been taken down. I reported the whole thing to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. I'm still creeped out when I think about what might have happened if I didn't trust my instincts. There's no way that guy was just an old landlord looking for a tenant. A couple of months ago, I was looking to make some quick cash, so I started browsing the gigs section on Craigslist. One post caught my eye: $500 for a 1-hour photo shoot. The ad didn't have a lot of details, just that they needed someone for a creative photography project, and the pay was high because it was last minute. I figured it was worth checking out. I responded to the ad, and within an hour, the guy emailed me back. He introduced himself as Greg and said he was a photographer looking for someone to model for a new art project he was working on. It was supposed to be a series of candid portraits, and he said I didn't need any modeling experience, just an interesting look. He asked me to meet him at a small studio he rented on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, the place was run down, not what I expected from someone supposedly paying $500 for an hour of work, but I figured maybe he was just a struggling artist. Greg met me outside. He looked normal enough, maybe mid-30s, casually dressed with a camera hanging around his neck. We went inside, and the studio was mostly empty, except for a backdrop and some basic photography equipment. He asked me to stand against the wall, and he started snapping pictures right away, not giving much direction. It felt awkward, but I thought, easy money. But then things got weird. He started asking me to pose in strange ways, like holding my arms above my head or lying down on the floor. At first, I went along with it, but it started feeling less like a photo shoot and more like he was just enjoying watching me follow his orders. When I asked what the photos were for, he brushed me off, saying it was all part of the process. The unease in my stomach was growing, so I said I wasn't comfortable with the direction the shoot was going and wanted to leave. That's when Greg's demeanor changed. He stopped taking pictures and just stood there staring at me. "You're not done yet," he said, his voice calm but unsettling. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but he stepped in front of me, blocking my way. "You said an hour," I reminded him, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You owe me more than that." At that point, I knew I needed to get out of there. I shoved past him, sprinted out the door, and didn't look back. As I drove away, I checked my phone and realized I had no signal the entire time I was there. I've since found out that the photo shoot scam is common on Craigslist, but what happened in that studio still gives me chills. Who knows what Greg had planned if I hadn't left when I did. I was selling a couple of old electronics on Craigslist. Just some things I didn't need anymore, like a tablet and an old phone. I'd done this before, so I didn't think much of it when someone named Matt messaged me, interested in buying both. He wanted to meet in a public place, which I appreciated. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop not far from my apartment. When I got there, Matt seemed normal enough, a little fidgety, but whatever. He looked at the items, said they were perfect, and handed me the cash. The transaction went smoothly, and we went our separate ways. Or so I thought. That evening, I noticed a car parked across the street from my apartment. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the night went on, the car didn't move. The next morning, it was gone, so I shrugged it off. But over the next few days, I started seeing the same car around my neighborhood, parked on different streets but always within sight of my building. One day I left my apartment and saw Matt standing by the car. He didn't even try to hide the fact that he was watching me. My stomach dropped. How did he know where I lived? I confronted him, asking what the hell he was doing. He just smiled and said, "I just wanted to make sure the stuff works." It was the creepiest, most nonsensical answer, and I didn't know what to say. I rushed back inside and locked the door. For the next week, I saw him almost every day. Sometimes he'd just be standing across the street, sometimes sitting in his car. I reported it to the police, but without any direct threat. There wasn't much they could do. One night I woke up to the sound of someone banging on my front door. I looked through the peephole and there he was, Matt, looking wild-eyed and frantic. "I just want to talk," he shouted. I called the police, and by the time they arrived, Matt was gone. I didn't see him again after that, but I moved out of my apartment a few months later, still paranoid that he might show up again. I was in the market for a used car and found what seemed like a great deal on Craigslist. An older sedan, well-maintained, for a price that was almost too good to be true. I contacted the seller, a guy named Brian, and he told me he needed to sell it quickly because he was moving overseas. We arranged to meet in a parking lot near the highway. When I got there, the car looked even better than in the photos, and Brian seemed like a regular guy. We chatted a bit about the car, and everything seemed legit. He handed me the keys for a test drive. As I drove, though, something felt off. The car worked fine, but when I asked for the vehicle's paperwork, title, registration, Brian said he forgot it at home. He got agitated when I said I wouldn't buy without it. When I returned to the parking lot, Brian's whole demeanor had changed. His friendly smile was gone. replaced by a cold stare. "You're buying the car today," he said flatly. I told him no way without the papers, but he stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "Get back in the car," he ordered. I knew I needed to get out of there. I made a dash for my own car, and as I peeled out of the parking lot, Brian was standing in the middle of the road, watching me with a look I'll never forget. I later found out the car was reported stolen weeks before. I'm still grateful I trusted my gut and didn't make the deal. A few years back, I found myself in a tight spot financially, and I needed a new roommate fast. I didn't have time to vet people through friends or coworkers, so I did what most desperate people do. I turned to Craigslist. I posted an ad describing the apartment. 2 bedrooms, a shared bathroom, rent split evenly. I wasn't asking for much, just someone who paid their share on time and wasn't a total nightmare to live with. Within a few hours, I got a response from a guy named Ben. He said he was in his late 20s, worked in construction, and was looking to move in immediately due to some personal issues with his current place. Desperation made me overlook how vague he was about his previous living situation. He came by to check out the apartment that evening. Ben seemed normal enough, friendly, easygoing, even cracked a few jokes. After a short chat, I figured he'd be fine. We agreed that he'd move in the next week. That's when things started to go downhill. The first few days were fine. He kept to himself, left for work early in the morning, and came back late. But then his hours started shifting. He was home at weird times, and I'd hear him moving around the apartment in the middle of the night. At first, I assumed he was just a night owl, but then I started noticing little things. Items in the bathroom would be moved. My food went missing from the fridge. I tried to shrug it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of muffled voices. It was coming from Ben's room, but when I listened more closely, I realized it was just him, talking to himself. I could only make out a few words here and there, but they were unsettling. "Can't let them find out. And have to be ready." I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe he was just going through something. But then one day I came home from work to find my bedroom door open. I always lock it when I leave. When I stepped inside, I saw my dresser drawers had been pulled open, and my clothes were tossed around. Panicking, I checked to see if anything was missing, but everything seemed to be there, except for a couple of personal items like old letters and photos. That night, I confronted Ben. I asked him point blank if he had been in my room. He just stared at me for a moment, then said, "Why would I want your stuff?" His tone was off, like he was mocking me. I dropped it, but from then on, I started locking my bedroom door even when I was home. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a soft knock on my bedroom door. It was Ben. He stood there in the hallway, shirtless, staring at me through the crack in the door. "I think we need to talk," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I told him I wasn't interested in talking at 3 a.m., but he wouldn't leave. "I've seen your stuff," he said. "I know things about you." I slammed the door and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I packed a bag, left the apartment, and crashed at a friend's place. When I went back to get the rest of my things, Ben was gone. His room was completely empty. He hadn't even left a note. The weirdest part? He never paid me a single cent of rent. I never saw him again, and his phone number was disconnected when I tried to call him. To this day, I have no idea who he really was. Like a lot of people, I love a good deal, so when I saw a free couch posted on Craigslist, I jumped on it. The pictures showed a slightly worn but still decent-looking sectional. The post said the owner was moving out of state and needed to get rid of it ASAP. I figured it was a great opportunity to upgrade my living room without spending a dime. I messaged the guy, whose name was Adam, and we arranged for me to pick it up the following evening. He seemed friendly enough in his replies, though a little eager for me to come after dark. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too focused on getting that couch. When I arrived at the address, the house was in a secluded part of town. It was old, a bit run down, but I told myself that was normal for someone who was moving out. Adam met me at the door. He looked a little rough, unshaven, wearing a stained shirt, but again I brushed it off. He led me inside, and sure enough, the couch was there in the living room, just like the pictures. But something felt off. The room was almost completely empty, aside from the couch. No moving boxes, no personal items. It didn't look like someone was packing up their life. It looked like no one had lived there for a long time. Adam told me I could take a seat while he grabbed some tools from the garage to help disassemble the couch. As I sat down, I noticed a strange smell, like something rotting. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting stronger by the minute. I looked around, trying to locate the source, and that's when I saw it. Stains. Dark, reddish-brown stains on the floor just under the couch. My stomach flipped. I stood up immediately and told Adam I had changed my mind, that I didn't need the couch after all. His entire demeanor shifted. His friendly tone vanished, replaced by something more sinister. "You can't leave yet," he said, stepping between me and the front door. My heart started racing. I tried to stay calm, but I knew I needed to get out of there fast. I mumbled something about forgetting my wallet in the car and edged toward the door. Adam didn't move, just stared at me, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. I bolted. I didn't even make it to my car before I heard him yell after me, "You'll regret this!" I didn't stop. I drove home shaking, replaying the scene in my head. The smell, the stains. What the hell was I about to take into my house? I reported the incident to the police, but they didn't find anything when they checked the house. Adam was gone. I never found out what was really going on there, but I know one thing. I'm never picking up free furniture from Craigslist again. I was fresh out of college and desperate for work. My student loans were looming, and I needed a job, any job, fast. I spent hours combing through Craigslist, applying for anything that seemed remotely legit. One listing caught my eye. Personal assistant needed. High pay, no experience required. I thought it was too good to be true, but I figured it was worth a shot. I emailed the guy, who called himself Steve, and within an hour he replied, saying he was interested in meeting me. He said he owned a small business and needed someone to help him with daily tasks, running errands, organizing his home office, things like that. We arranged to meet at a diner the next day. Steve was much older than I expected, probably in his mid-50s, balding with an unkempt beard. He was friendly enough at first, asking basic questions about my experience and availability. But as the conversation went on, things started getting weird. He asked if I was okay with personal tasks, like cleaning his house or maybe even cooking for him. I hesitated, but he reassured me the pay would be worth it. He mentioned he lived alone, way out in the country, and would need me to drive out there regularly. My gut was telling me to walk away, but I was broke and desperate, so I agreed to give it a shot. A few days later, I drove out to his house. It was in the middle of nowhere, isolated with no neighbors in sight. The house itself was run down, the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie. Steve greeted me at the door with a smile, but something about it didn't sit right with me. He showed me around the house, which was cluttered with random junk. There were piles of old newspapers, broken furniture, and boxes filled with God knows what. I was supposed to organize it all, but as we walked through the house, Steve started getting closer to me. Too close. He started making comments about how young I looked, how he liked having fresh faces around. My skin was crawling, but I tried to play it cool, hoping to just get through the day and never come back. But then, as I was sorting through one of the boxes in the garage, he came up behind me and put his hand on my shoulder. "You know," he said, "I've been looking for more than just an assistant." I froze. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of there. I mumbled something about needing to grab something from my car, and before he could stop me, I bolted. I didn't even look back as I sped away from that house. Needless to say, I never went back. I blocked Steve's number and reported him to Craigslist, but I doubt anything ever came of it. The whole experience still gives me chills. It was a reminder that desperation can make you ignore the red flags, but I'll never let myself get that close to danger again. I was looking to sell my old car on Craigslist. It was a beat-up sedan that had served me well through college, but I needed something more reliable. Within a day of posting it, I got a message from a guy named Brian who said he was interested and wanted to meet up that evening to check it out. We agreed to meet in a parking lot of a strip mall, a place I figured was public and safe. When I pulled in, Brian was already there, leaning against his car. He was a tall guy, dressed in work boots and a flannel shirt, looking every bit like a regular dude. We exchanged pleasantries and he started inspecting the car. He seemed knowledgeable, asking the right questions about mileage, any issues with the engine, and so on. I was feeling good about the whole thing until he asked if he could take it for a test drive. I hesitated. I didn't want to hand over the keys to a stranger, but he insisted, saying he'd leave his car as collateral. Reluctantly, I agreed. We got in the car together, and that's when things started feeling off. Brian didn't drive around the parking lot like I expected. Instead, he pulled out onto the road and started heading toward the outskirts of town. I told him to turn around, that I wasn't comfortable going that far, but he ignored me, his grip tightening on the wheel. "You know," he said, glancing over at me, "a car like this could fetch a lot more if you knew the right people." I didn't respond, my heart pounding in my chest. We were driving farther and farther away from the mall, and I realized I had no idea where we were going. I told him to pull over, that I wanted out of the car, but he just smiled. "Relax," he said. "I'm just taking a shortcut." That's when I saw it. A dirt road up ahead leading into the woods. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what his plan was, but I wasn't about to find out. I reached for the door handle, ready to jump out if I had to. But Brian suddenly slammed on the brakes, throwing me forward. "I'm just messing with you," he said, laughing. But there was something cold in his eyes.